Yeah. That'll be free.
Oh,
It's okay? Sure. Okay. Hello. Thanks for coming. Wow, that's too loud, maybe.
what do you guys think?
Too loud.
Is this loud? Good over there, loud here. Perfect in the middle. Okay. Everybody move to the middle. I'm really excited to introduce David Graeber, one of the most inspiring people ever, anthropologist, and obviously drawer of crowds. He came up with, or he was one of the 4 collaborators in the "We Are the 99% slogan." Long story. Founded the Anti-Capitalist Convergence along with at least 40 other people. He's very humble. And he's called Occupy Wall Street the opening salvo in a wave of negotiations over the dissolution of the American empire. So he's extremely apropos of a revolutionary speaking series. And it's fantastic that this is at the Hemispheric Institute. Thanks to Hemi for hosting this and all the other lectures in this series. So it's called, David's talk is Culture as Creative Refusal, or something like that.
Thank you so much. Hi. I'd like to give a paper. Actually, this is about a summary of the argument of a book that I told people I was going to be writing this year, but actually didn't. I'm actually on a fellowship from the British Academy, and this was what I said I would write, and I wanted to write it. I just got caught up in events. So I'm really actually glad to have this opportunity to think about what I really ought to have been doing all this time. And it's a project that emerges from it's something I threw out in a book called Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. I made a section called Blowing Up Walls, where I was talking about conceptual walls. So how, whenever you talk about revolutions, we have like the same 20, 30 examples that we always trundle out. And social movements, we have a very limited number of examples, partly because we assume that anything that happened before about 1750, or maybe the English Revolution, is just a completely different universe. It has no relevance to anything contemporary at all. With the effect that we take about 95% of all human political experience, and we just sort of trundle it off, and that sort of primitive stuff, or agrarian empires, however, it's not modern. And it struck me that this is a real impoverishment of the potential for radical thought, because a lot of problems that people faced at different times in history are not that different than ones we face today. And of course, it has all sorts of other obnoxious effects as well, along with like limiting our sense of human possibilities, of, sort of convincing us that other people are fundamentally different sorts of being. So I sort of set off on this route. I acted a passage. I said, what if we kicked this whole apparatus away? What if we blew up the wall? What if we accepted that the people who Columbus or Vasco da Gama discovered on their expeditions were just us? Or certainly just as much us as Columbus or Vasco da Gama ever were. And our whole idea of politics changes. In one way, one realization I had is that it would really help in overcoming one of the most pernicious effects of this conceptual wall, is that whenever we talk about, certainly anybody who used to be called primitive, or whatever they want to call them nowadays, stateless societies, but hunter-gatherers especially, you really haven't gotten over the Hobbes versus Rousseau split. Either they're sort of idyllic example of what we should all go back to, or they're sort of Steve Pinker or someone like that, and their violent, horrible lives that show us how far we've come. And what people never seem to notice is that these societies are all incredibly different from one another. And in fact, being so small scale, they are much more different. I mean, they explore, in a way you can think of them as a series of sort of cosmological experiments. You can just go 5 miles down the road and another 10 miles down the road and come up with completely different conceptions of what human beings are, what they're about, what they should expect from the universe, and what sort of institutions appropriate for them to pursue it might be. And this is what strikes me as politically, this is what's really interesting about such societies. they're archipelagos of human possibilities, if you will. And within those societies, it struck me that we have various mechanisms to sort of cause us to become blind to the way that a lot of these experiments are to some degree self-conscious. That politics is not something that only happened recently. And I really got onto it. So I started thinking, what if like a lot of the structures that we think of as cultures are to some degree, can be conceived as social movements that were to some degree successful in achieving their objectives? And one could qualify this in a lot of ways, but if you start from that idea, history starts looking very different in a lot of really interesting ways. So the idea of the book I wanted to write was to explore what world history would look like if we start seeing cultures, religious movements and so forth, as more self-conscious social movements, for good or for ill, than we're used to thinking. And I really set off on this. There were sort of two things that I read that really struck me. One was by Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss's theory of civilization, which nobody really talks about nowadays. He lived in a period, he was writing this stuff in a period in the 1920s when diffusionism was a big thing. So people would write whole dissertations on, cat's cradles in the Pacific region, and you trace out different cat cradle patterns and like map out each island and would try to figure out sort of paths by which different like cat's cradle patterns would spread from one to the other. And Mauss basically argued this entire project was silly. And I guess everyone that I know has decided this project is silly, but he came up with a very interesting reason that has been lost to history why it's silly. He said, well, anybody can get on a boat and go anywhere, and over thousands of years, everybody, there's no place that hasn't been visited by somebody from some other place. Societies have been interconnected for thousands of years. The idea that we're imagining anybody as isolated from one another is absurd. In fact, Mauss thought of his ethnographic region as the Pacific, and he just assumed that people from China must have gone to South America and vice versa at some point or another. He said, rather than try to trace out how things spread, because we have to assume that everybody was exposed to everything at one time or another, what is really interesting is to study what people decided not to adopt. He said, if you look at it ethnographically, you see striking examples of non-adaptation of customs all the time. For example, if you go up to the Canadian far north, you will find that Algonquian speakers have snowshoes, but they never use kayaks. It's like obviously the most intelligent type of boat to adopt if you're living in that area, but that's what Inuit do, so they never do that. Inuit, meanwhile, have kayaks, but they never use snowshoes. Something interesting is going on. There has to be some form of conscious refusal going on here. It's not that they're not exposed to it, they know all about it. They know it's better, they're not going to use it anyway. And all over history, we find things like this over and over again. So perhaps what civilizations are forms of refusal, of diffusion of customs, ideas, and cultures that they know all about. And he didn't put a particularly political color on this observation, but it lays itself open to that. And one of the most interesting suggestions of how one could think of that came from rather unlikely source. There's an essay called The Shamanic Trance, was it Trace, by Peter Lamborn Wilson, sometimes also known as Hakim Bey. It came out of a shamanism and anarchism seminar he had with Michael Tausig many years ago. And the essay is sort of scattershot, as one might expect. But it has one section in it that I think is incredibly important. Talking about, well, he deals with a very specific case, but I'm going to generalize from what he says. He says, well, what he basically argues is we're used to looking at Northeast Woodlands Native American societies as being these sort of primordial examples of societies that are both extraordinarily individualistic and extraordinarily egalitarian at the same time. And much political hay has been made of this ever since, well, for hundreds of years, really. There's all sorts of Renaissance essays about this, and people arguing how much of American ideas of liberties are indirectly inspired by these societies, along with a sort of ecological orientation. And there's arguments about how much of that ecological orientation, or even the individualism and egalitarianism, or sort of dialectical reactions to settler society. But what Peter Lamborn Wilson points out is no one ever seems to bring into this the obvious fact that there were large urban civilizations in all along the Mississippi for a very long period of time, and that those cities kind of dissolved away and vanished several generations before the settlers showed up. If you think about it, what's the chance there wasn't some relation here? I mean, it's not clear, and people argue all the time about what brought those civilizations down, whether it was ecological, whether it was social unrest. But clearly there must have been all sorts of political maneuvering back and forth, and if you find these fiercely egalitarian people sort of living in the shadows of where a civilization just fell apart, well, what do you think is going on? So, and essentially what he suggested is that, one of the reasons why hippies are so attracted to, certain Native American societies is basically they were hippies. These were the guys who ran away, the rebels, so forth and so on, from this urban civilization. And, since we have this obsession with seeing anything like these societies as being somehow primordial, and wiping out history and politics from the equation, we can't notice this. And I had to think about it, and I thought, well, there's a lot one can do with this. A lot of the examples, for example, as an anarchist, I have to deal with primitivists all the time. And what primitivists generally do is they take these anthropological studies from the 1960s, the Marshall studies of Kalahari Kung and others, and sort of generalize from them to say that through most of human history we lived in these tiny egalitarian bands. Now, subsequent ethnography has made it very clear that almost all the populations that look like this are not particularly typical of what most hunter-gatherers probably looked like throughout, say, the Paleolithic or Mesolithic. In fact, they're usually now seen as refugee populations that have been kicked out of all the places that anybody else wanted. And there's a reason why they have very little social structure. But it's also possible to see them as not just refugees, but as defectors. But they clearly know about and are living in reaction to other forms of society that exist around them. In a way, there's been a whole literature that's emerged on this. Jim Scott recently came out with a book called The Art of Not Being Governed, an anarchist history of Southeast Asia, where he points out that most people in most of Southeast Asian history didn't live in states, but in societies that seemed to organize themselves around being impossible to be governed by states. But in a way, according to his reading, which I think is a little overstated, basically their entire social organization is a kind of anti-state. They're making themselves impossible to be governed from these central regimes, which only really took in 20 to 30% of the total population. I think that Jim Scott's stuff is great, I love it, but he has a tendency to look at one dimension of a problem quite self-consciously, so it lends itself to a kind of reading where you think that's all that's going on. And the problem with these kinds of analysis where you see people as simply negating something else or some form of power is that you don't really think about what they're for. It's a problem with most resistance literature. And I wanted to see if it were possible to have a more nuanced view of history which takes that kind of inspiration, that politics is not something that just happened recently, and that a lot of what we now see as societies are in some ways reactions to something without romanticizing the situation. I think one really good example of that, it shows the deep ambivalence, is the origins of Middle Eastern patriarchy. Here I'm inspired by some of the feminist writings of Gerda Lerner and others who wrote a book. It was called The Creation or Invention of Patriarchy, I can't remember which. Just taking patriarchy here, not in the sense of any system of male dominance, but for classical patriarchy, the guys with their long beards and sequestering women away. And how did this come about? Because one of the really striking things about what we know from early Sumerian history is that the general political freedoms and status of women seems to go backwards over the first 1,000 years in a really dramatic way. When the curtain kind of goes up, the first records we have, you have women administrators, women doctors, women scribes, women heads of state. It's not as many. It's more a situation not unlike what might pertain today. And it goes backwards very quickly. Well, I guess not very quickly, since we're talking about thousands of years. But in terms of the records we have, it seems to go backwards very quickly. And to the point where it's not even clear there was a word for virginity. In early Sumerian texts, there becomes this obsession with it, like by 1,500 years later. And the usual reason for this, that people usually ascribe it to cultural change. There's an assumption that there's these waves of Semitic pastoralists sweeping in from the desert. And it's true that Sumerian disappears as a language, is replaced by Assyrian, Akkadian, and then Amorite, and then Aramaic. So the usual explanation is there are these nomads who are these pastoral biblical patriarch types who kind of come in and take over the cities and or either in small groups or vast invasions, historians argue which, and gradually their mores replace the existing ones. But it's a little shaky because it's clear that their mores don't replace urban mores in a lot of areas. Why would it, in the area of women's status, does it seem to change everything? My own research suggests that the picture is a lot more complicated, and it has a lot to do with debt, and I actually cover this in my debt book, that you have what essentially happens is you have a shift from what I call human economy, where money, insofar as there is currency, is used largely to rearrange social relations, to a situation where you have more and more what resembles a commercial economy. And when that happens, pretty much everywhere where it can be observed, the immediate thing is a crisis over slavery and prostitution. So that, whereas at one point sexual relations are legitimate if currency has changed hands, suddenly it becomes a huge moral crisis. And it became a particular crisis around temples, because there appear to have been certain types of sexual rituals which were very important. We don't really know much about them. They're discussed in the literature as sacred prostitution, which is clearly an inappropriate phrase, since if you don't have cash, it's kind of hard to imagine how you could have prostitution. But I won't go into the intricacies. But what seems to have happened was that that they gradually developed around these temples, places where there was something more like actual red light zones. And the people who ended up the denizens of those red light zones were debt peons, because there was constant debt crises where people would come and repossess first your flocks and fields and then eventually members of your family who were put to work in the red light zones, both boys and girls actually, but particularly girls. And and one reaction was defection. Whereas in Greece they tended to rise up, in Mesopotamia they tended to run away. And the way you run away is you join the pastoral nomads, because there's always this fringe of pastoral nomads around the city. So gradually more and more people, they would have to have periodic debt cancellations. I always point out the first word for freedom we actually know in any human language is the Sumerian word amargi, which literally means return to mother, because they would declare debt freedom and everybody got to go home. But if they were not wise enough to put this in, these sort of policies into effect, more and more people would sort of join the nomads would eventually sweep into the city. But the people who ran away were like, their great paranoia was having their daughter taken away and turned into a prostitute at some great temple. So if you think about the image of Babylon, which is sort of a place of both high finance and prostitution and sin, sort of echoes in patriarchal religions ever since. You see it in the Bible, you see it in Rome, where St. Peter refers to Rome as Babylon. You see it in Rastafarians, right? To this day, which are almost all these religions are both assertions of patriarchal authority, but also of a certain type of resistance to hierarchies and abuses created by certain forms of financial concentration and debt peonage. It's a great social crisis in much of the world. So here's an example of a movement of resistance whose social effects are in many ways quite pernicious. So I wanted to bring home the ambivalence of these things. And the more I started looking at it, the more I realized that you can see things like this, that kind of back and forth movement of cultural definition through resistance, over and over again in world history. To go back to the Mesopotamian case, another phenomena which I had not been aware of until I met an archaeologist named David Wingrove in London is the phenomenon of the Bronze Age potlatch. It's quite fascinating, actually, that one of the great mysteries of archaeology is that scattered all the way from India to Eastern Europe, you find these caves, pits, or other locations where people take lots and lots of precious metals and either dump them or destroy them. Huge quantities, and it never happens inside the big cities. It never happens in the areas immediately controlled by the big cities. It always happens in the hills, usually in some place trading with the big cities, providing them some kind of raw material, but trying to resist getting drawn into their cultural orbit. And what Graeber suggests is this is much like the famous potlatch rituals of, say, the First Nations of the Northwest Coast, or kind of thing you see in places like Papua New Guinea, where people are having these extravagant feasts and either wasting or destroying huge amounts of wealth to show their contempt for material goods, usually in sort of heroic competitions. It seems to be the same sort of thing, but the difference is that, you know, in the colonial world, when you have phenomena like that, it's a form of resistance against the values of commercial bureaucratic civilizations that are about to overwhelm them, because they're totally outgunned, outnumbered, and were utterly overwhelmed. Whereas these guys, in many cases, seem to have won. So, you know, outside the fringe of the sort of patriarchal nomads, you have the fringe of the barbarians, as the civilized people tended to call them. And if you look at where these giant deposits of precious destroyed or dumped goods are, they're almost all the places that created the heroic epics. You know, the Homeric epics come from those zones, the Vedic, or the Sanskrit epics, the Celtic fringe was that to the Greek civilizations. There's actually a fascinating book written about heroic societies, written by Monroe Chadrick in 1926, which sort of tries to trace out civilizations like that as a single type. And they seem to be these guys that sort of form on the fringes of urban civilizations and are just self-consciously rejecting the materialistic values of accumulation and bureaucracy that they create, but they create something very different. They basically aristocratic societies. I'll go through the qualities of heroic societies, but they crop up all over the world in much the same form. People like the Kwak-Yodel were just one familiar case. They tend to be aristocracies that are fiercely competitive, where you have a series of sort of heroic figures surrounded by retainers and often slaves, but without any centralized state authority. So you have an aristocracy, but you don't have a state. Politics is composed of a history of sort of personal debts of loyalty or vengeance between these individuals. Everybody knows who stole whose wife, who betrayed who lied to who hates who loves who. There's a huge amount of room to move up or down. The aristocracy usually claims that they're, you know, based on blood, but they're really not. They almost always focus on game-like contests as their primary ritual, often with massive amounts of loot or wealth being squandered or redistributed in colorful ways. Or animal sacrifice, often huge numbers of animals sacrificed at once. That's another big thing. They find lots of bones. Something's going on. They slaughtered 1,000 cows. You know, that happens in the epics too. Along with theatricality, boasting and lying is an extremely well-developed trait of heroic societies. Self-aggrandizement. In fact, warfare often consists of, you know, these sort of heroic guys taunting one another, you know, for half an hour, and then one will throw a spear. I mean, you sort of see this in Homer, but it's a very common pattern. All explicitly resist features of nearby urban civilizations, often specifically writing, for which they tend to substitute poets or priests who engage in rote memorization. And elaborate techniques of oral composition, hence the epics, and also usually commerce. Now, the interesting thing about these heroic societies is that, in a way, as I say, often they were quite successful in their resistance to the values of the urban civilizations. In some cases, strange cases of fusion take place. So I actually think of the classical world of Greece and Rome as being a kind of hybrid of heroic societies and the urban societies which ultimately inspired them. Is you have this kind of combination of what they called the Greek agon system, where they would just make everything into a contest. It draws on Homer and the idea of games, turning everything into a game, which their politics comes down to the same thing. There's an interesting point that electoral politics even is a sort of a heroic holdover. It contains most of those qualities, that sort of turning everything into a game, personalizing everything, also these sort of boasting and lying elements, but also the idea that everybody's constantly maneuvering to assemble retainers. It's throughout the ancient world, for example, election was considered the aristocratic mode of selecting leadership, not the democratic one. The democratic one was lottery. So Athens, when they needed officials, they would just like anybody who's qualified, if you pass a test or something, you put your name in a hat and pick something out. Whereas election was assumed to be about people who already thought that they were the best and turning it to their retainers to decide who were everybody, or potential retainers in this case, to decide who's the best of all. It was inherently aristocratic. So these various movements left all sorts of interesting traces. But I wanted to end by talking about Madagascar, which is my original piece of fieldwork, because it's a really fascinating case on a lot of levels of how much our ideas of primordialism, our erasure of politics, and our blindness to this sort of play back and forth of constant mutual counter definitions and counter definitions, the fact that cultures are, to a certain degree, the sediments of past social movements, how much are being blind to that makes us ignore things that are just really obvious right in front of our eyes. Madagascar is a fascinating place because it's the last large habitable area of the Earth to be settled. It seems that people only came there maybe around 600 AD. I mean, the history of Madagascar is a beautiful example of the pernicious effects of sexist language. There's this huge debate over when did man come to Madagascar. There's plenty of evidence that there's some people there killing dwarf hippopotamuses and having feasts in 100 AD and 100 BC, but it never seems to come to anything. Because it's really clear that the real question is not when man came to Madagascar, but when women came to Madagascar. You have a bunch of guys tooling around, it's really not going to mean much in the long run. They can have a feast, they go away. Anyway, so it seems that people drop by a lot, but permanent settlement only happened around 600, maybe even 700 AD. So, and it's the people of Madagascar now, it's an Afro-Asian population. The language is mainly from Indonesia. And it seems to be this fascinating cultural synthesis. There's been people speculating for years how this happened. And almost invariably, they start with this assumption that here we have somehow some guys must have come from Borneo. The first linguists who looked at it figured out that the language is most closely related to some of the Burrito group of languages, Burrito Valley group of languages in Borneo. So there are all these sort of speculations that guys, even though those guys don't do much seafaring now, probably in the early Middle Ages they did, and maybe they moved from here to there, and they went to Ceylon. And then they moved down the coast, and there were various theories about how these guys must have got there. But the assumption is always somehow this bunch of Swidden agriculturalists showed up in this big island and kind of spread out and gradually developed chiefdoms and then states, and then they ran into world religions and had ambivalent relations to them, so forth and so on. Okay, so this is the way the story is always told. The moment you sort of take any sort of realistic assessment of what must have happened, and I think both current linguistics and current archaeology are really coming around to this, you realize that whoever were the first people to settle Madagascar, they knew all about states, they knew all about world religions, and they wanted nothing to do with them. Very, very self-consciously. So, in fact, the linguistic evidence is quite clear. It turns out that, yes, the most common, the sort of main source of Malagasy language is this one area of Borneo, but there's various terms scattered in there that come from other islands of Indonesia, and all of the nautical terminology, the calendrical terminology, the technical stuff is in Malay. Now, how did that happen? Well, the Malaysians were the great seafarers. They were merchants. They were trading in Mozambique, right opposite Madagascar. And you're trading in this area. There's a giant uninhabited island right there. What are you going to do? You're going to leave a trade colony. Well, who are you going to leave there? Well, maybe you'll leave a couple of merchants, but mostly you'll leave your slaves, right? Which is why you're going to have a group of people drawn from different parts of Indonesia. That's where Malay city-states got their slaves from, places like Borneo. What's going to happen if you leave a lightly guarded group of slaves on a giant uninhabited island? It's kind of common sense, right? I mean, how are you going to catch them? So the first population of Madagascar seems to have been a group of escaped slaves. But the interesting thing that archaeologists discover is that for the first few hundred years, until maybe 11, 12, 1300 even. There are all sorts of different people. Like every valley seems to be sort of culturally different. And there's a little tiny Swahili-speaking city-state called Mahilika. At least that's what it's called now. No one knows what the original name was because it was abandoned around 1250 or 1300. Nobody knows quite why. The official archaeological reason is that they were change in the nature of the chlorite schist trade. This green rock that they were trading there. But it probably is a little more complicated than that. Actually, the one reference that seems to be to the city-state of Mahilika occurs in Idrisi, the 11th century Arabic traveler, who says, "The island is traversed by a mountain called Wabra. The vagabonds who are expelled from the town flee there, and form a brave and numerous company, which frequently infest the region surrounding the town, and who live on top of the mountain, and they state a defense against the ruler of the island. They are courageous and feared for their arms and number." So there's a lot going on here again. So it seems like there was a little Swahili-speaking city-state. A lot of people ran away from that. There were these escaped Indonesian-speaking slaves in the hills. They joined together at some point around, archaeologists argue about when, there's a kind of a fusion in what is now Malagasy culture is created, which has equal African, Indonesian elements tumbled together in various ways, but it's remarkably uniform across a huge island, it's 1,000 miles long. The question is, what's remarkable is that nobody seems to pay much attention to the actual quality of what unifies this Malagasy culture and its political implications, because the moment you start thinking about it in this light, it's almost obvious what's going on. I mean, first of all, they have a series of myths and a kind of a national epic. The myths are basically jokes. They all have kings and gods in them, but they're always the villains. To give you a sense of what these things are like, the kind of tagline that you give at the end of a myth, like, and they live happily ever after, in Malagasy it's like, "It is not I who lie, these lies come from ancient times." So they have these myths, which they call lies, and the sort of national epic is about this fellow named Rakut, who wants to prove that he wasn't created by God. So I was going to give an example. This is actually why I went to Madagascar, and I just wanted a chance to tell this story. I started reading these stories, and it's like, I have to go there. It's a fascinating spin on a very common Austronesian theme, so you should look at this, of sacrifice. Because normally in Austronesian, including Indonesian cultures, sacrifice is this dealing with this human paradox that fertility comes from the gods, so gods naturally own everything because they provide the fertility required to create that thing, but then, so you have to bring them in to fertilize things and then get rid of them again. So very often you invite the gods and then you have to expel them. So sacrifice is both. But in this version, there's the version, my favorite version. In this version, the hero is called Andri Mama Puitra, but I'll just call him Rakut. So there is this guy who, this person was born who decided that he was not created by God. And he wanted God to recognize that and acknowledge that God had not created him. So he decided to build a really big sacrificial fire. And normally, when you sacrifice, the smoke goes up to heaven and God smell it. Much as an ancient Greek sacrifice. So he decided to build a really nasty fire, giant fire. Smoke went up to heaven, and people started choking in heaven. It was very unpleasant. God sent down this great bird and, to him and said, "What's going on? God's upset, his kids can't breathe up there. What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I want him to come down here and acknowledge that he did not create me." Bird said, "That's ridiculous," went up to fetch God. God can't, so God first, he sent out a thunderstorm, put out the fire, but the guy hid it in the cave, took it out again. This went on for some time. Finally, God came down. He said, "All right, what's the deal?" And I said, "Well, you did not create me, and I want you to acknowledge that." And God said, "Well, let's see, I'm going to test you." So he picked up his cane, he flipped it in the air and said, "Okay, tell me which is the top end and which is the bottom." Tumbled and fell, and he immediately identified which it was. God said, okay, you're a pretty smart guy. How about this? So he brought down 3 cows from heaven. It's interesting that power is generic. All powerful things in Malagasy myth are exactly the same. So individualism seems to be for us humans. So God brings down 3 cows from heaven. One is a mother, daughter, and granddaughter, and says, okay, tell me which is which. They all both look exactly the same. He can tell immediately. God brings down his own mother, sister, and daughter, or wife and daughter, all of them look exactly the same. And he can tell immediately. And God says, all right, okay, you're a smart guy. Tell you what are we going to do about this? Let's have a contest of trickery. The guy says, yeah, that's a good idea, because we'll have a contest of magic, and if I can trick you, then you have to admit that you didn't create me. If you can trick me, then I'll acknowledge. So they set off together, and they walk down the road, and they kind of take turns. So first, the guy runs ahead, and he turns into a little fountain of fruit trees, and God comes on it and says, I'm really tired, I'm really thirsty, maybe I'll have a drink at this fountain, it looks really nice, and some fruit, and suddenly he's, you're not fooling anyone, that's you, come on. Turns back into a human. So then God goes ahead and turns into a giant field of animals and chickens and vegetables, and guy gets really hungry as he's walking along and is about to eat some, says, no, that's you guys, and yeah, damn. So they go back and forth for a while, and finally the guy runs ahead and he turns into a large and prosperous village with many attractive inhabitants, and at this point God is very sleepy. He needs a place to stay for the night, so he sees this village. The headman says, oh yes, why don't you stay in my place? I'll introduce you to my 3 beautiful daughters. God falls in love with the youngest daughter, they get married. So very quickly she becomes pregnant, and it's a Malagasy tradition, as in many places, that if you're pregnant you can sort of order your husband around getting you any kind of food that you crave. So at one point she says, I've got this weird desire to eat rat meat. And God says, why? He says, I don't know, it's come over me. Can you get me a rat or 2 and cook them up? And God says, well, all right. And turns into a cat, goes into the house, gets some rats, comes out, chops them up small, minces them with some garlic, and she says, so I changed my mind. God, what I really want is you to eat it. Yes, dear, whatever you say. So he goes through all of this, and about a few months later, she's about to give birth, and instead of a normal birth, the baby sort of climbs out of the womb, walks up to him and says, ha, gotcha. And not only that, I did eat rats, didn't I? So now you have to admit that I was not created by you. Whereupon God is very upset and confused, and wanders off back to heaven and tries to forget the whole thing ever happened. But every now and then he remembers the incident and gets upset and throws lightning at the earth. The end. So you get the idea. I mean, this is the kind of mythic cycle you would expect to have from a group of 2 different groups of escaped slaves who sort of joined together in the hinterland of a giant uninhabited island and managed to fend off all those people who came for them. And the fascinating thing is, if you look at the history of Madagascar, because it's a big island, a lot of things happen. Eventually they start doing slave trading, kingdoms spring up. Because you notice in the story, right? It's got all those elements, but ultimately God did create him, right? Because God's his father now, but in the most embarrassing and horrible possible way. Right? So they play on the ambivalence, but they turn it really to the advantage of the underdog. All right, so if you look at this, you can see a beautiful example of this kind of back and forth, because here you have this obvious sort of rebel, defiant society. We were not created by God. But at the same time, you have kingdoms do gradually rise up, so that story becomes twisted around and turned into a national epic, weirdly enough, because it's a person who claims that he was not created by man, and they just flip it around. And this is in the course of the creation of the Marin Kingdom, which is a vast kingdom which dominates the island in alliance with England, and then it falls apart. When I actually was in Marin, which is the part of the country which was once was the center of that kingdom, which turned that story into a national epic. what I discovered was a society which was profoundly anti-heroic. It's a kind of dialectical opposition of a dialectical opposition. You have this creation of heroic societies in a form of schismogenesis, as anthropologists say, sort of mutual contrastive extremism, where you start with minor differences and they become bigger and bigger until you're defining yourselves completely against the values of the other. It's clear that's how the heroic societies seem to have come about, but here you go to Madagascar and you discover that the dialectical opposition of that, which is not a bureaucratic commercial civilization, but a fiercely egalitarian society where every single sort of self-aggrandizing quality that marks heroic societies is itself systematically negated. So by the time I got there, people weren't telling those stories. Actually, the most effective way of taking the subversive power of stories like that ever created is to force people to learn them in third grade. As soon as you do that, they lose all their power. Everybody hates them. So they did that. So people don't tell those stories anymore. But instead, what I found was everywhere you look, you have a systematic negation of heroic society, the basic principles. So that, for example, every mountain has a dead king on top of it. But every single story about who these dead kings were was like, well, the village I was in, there were these two mountains overlooking it, and people said, well, there's this guy, his name was Rakutmaditra, which sort of means like young man, bad attitude, or sometimes it's called Ra-le-luz, which just means like the great disaster. He was like the last king, and he used to like make everybody weave silk all the time. Sometimes he just cut off all the women's hair to build a bridge because he wasn't willing to walk on the ground. So he just walked in these bridges between the mountains until one day his father took pity on the people and chopped it and fell to his death. Other places, these people still possess people, all these kings. And other places, there are shrines to kings who voluntarily gave up their nobility and thus became immortal. So there's a complete rejection of the sort of heroic value of kings. There's also a rejection of the moral economy of feuds and rivalries. Every place I went, people said, if you ask about the local history, they tell these stories of like, well, we're not allowed to marry the people of that clan because of our ancestors. And they say, oh, why? And so, well, actually, it's really stupid. I mean, one of them like had a quarrel over some chickens, and they decided to like fight their dogs against each other, but both cheated, and one accused the other of cheating, and then they cursed each other, and they're just a bunch of idiots, So every single aspect of heroic, society is reproduced in the stories, and people just say, yeah, what a bunch of fools. It's completely pathetic. And the sort of height of this is the notion of negative authority, which is not the lack of authority. It's not like you can have any society with no conception of authority, but their conception of authority is very specifically built around the notion that authority means telling people not to do things. So elders come in, they can impose taboos, they can tell kids who are being too individualistic and disruptive to cut it out, but they never come up with ideas of their own. These all ideas have to come from Faraisa and Kina, which basically means consensus process. This sort of elaborate process of finding consensus among a community, so that any project, even if you decide to build a road or something like that, can't have an author. So sort of boasting, similarly, is the most embarrassing thing anybody can possibly do. Public confrontation is like completely negated. So you have a society where almost all of their values, I remember when I came back from Madagascar, the things that like surprise you always are always very unexpected. Like, surprises, by definition, unexpected. But you're always surprised by things that you hadn't really noticed about your own society. One of the major things that freaked me out when I came back from Madagascar, it took me days to figure out, was we seemed really quiet everywhere. It was spooky. And I was trying to figure out why, and after about 3 days I realized, like, where are all the kids? There's no children. As we're sitting in this room, if this were Madagascar, there'd be kids running around in the hall. There'd be kids. Everywhere you go, there's children. Like, they have to hide them away here. But the other thing was people arguing. Whenever I would see people arguing in public, I'd say, aren't they ashamed for their families? And look, they're just arguing in public. So there's this incredibly non-confrontational attitude. Any public display of competition is utterly negated, which is compensated by the fact that the Malagasy language appears to have more languages than any other, more words than any other language in the world for annoying. 47 different ways to say somebody's getting on your nerves, but you never say them in public. Everybody sort of goes home, complains all day. But it's a perfect example. I could go on at great length of the negation of a negation. It is a sort of self-conscious political definition around rejecting the values of a heroic society, which are themselves, at a previous historical stage, a rejection of the notions of sort of commercial bureaucratic societies. And I think that it would be really interesting to rewrite world history in this way, as a series of movements and counter-movements, rather than a notion of sort of primordial development or decline, or the ways that it's currently written. So this is the book that I will someday write. Anybody want to ask something? Okay.
I got one page.
Well, okay.
First, this is about.
Well, this was 3.5 pages, so at that rate, you'll be here for about half an hour. Okay.
It's about the adapting people, not people who are preserve their culture and don't wear snowshoes.
Mm-hmm.
The Inuit class. Okay, so I agree with your concepts regarding fiat currency and debt as being as only a recent phenomenon in human history. However, the Industrial Revolution is also a recent phenomenon, beginning with Johannes Gutenberg and the printing press. There is a distinction and awareness to be made between open design software and hardware engineers who seek to mass produce not just the product but the means of production, and a Marxian issue addressed by the Rutgraf 3D printer completed in 2008 at the University of Bath, England, and it is a rapidly prototypable printer.
Okay.
The distinction between vector and capitalist class is different from that. It seeks to retain the exclusive ownership of new means of capital production, such as proprietary licensed software and internet infrastructure, as opposed to general public license software. My question is, to what extent do you seek or are actively engaged in finding public compatibility with your popular, culturally anarchist views and the lesser known but equally anarchist, self-replicating, open manufacturing engineers who borrow concepts from biology, which is my undergraduate background, by developing environmentally biodegradable machinery akin to DNA, which evolved to be physically copied and pasted, in other words, eating your cake and having it too, in the scientific engineering community, among those that are openly or relatively leftist. There is an effort to create a distributed means of production in such an inexpensive way as to render a debt economy obsolete, using principles of the post-scarcity concept. Lastly, I began this research in 2006 discovering Charles Percy Snow's 1959 lecture, The Two Cultures, which described the gap in academic discourse between humanities and sciences, which I would go so far as to say it is a wedge created by propagandists and provided in me.
Oh.
That's all.
Oh, okay. What was the question? There was a question in the middle, right?
Yeah.
I think I was a cultural elitist during the question. What was that?
No. I just asked, like, you talk with engineers.
That's a different paper. This has nothing to do with that, but I can talk about that. I actually am a ardently pro-technology anarchist. I actually think that the great problem that we have nowadays is that capitalism has become a brake on any sort of reasonable technological development, especially towards social means, and all the more reason to get rid of it. I actually wrote a piece in the Baffler, that new Baffler, which is all about that. And they did the cartoons, not me, but it has this wonderful picture of these guys re-landing on the moon and flying an anarchist flag. I mean, the substance of the thing is a little bit far from what I was talking about, but I'm very sympathetic with the notion that there is huge social potential in those new technologies, particularly insofar as they escape from the control of capital, which, as I say, I think is more acting as a block on any sort of sensible development than anything else. But but it would take a long time to get that papers. Other questions?
Thank you for that. That was really amazing. Can I ask a very short question?
Okay, please do.
Would it be one way of saying what you just said, to say in Hawaii when they killed Captain Cook, they did it because they were perfectly aware of who he was?
You know, that's a really good question. Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, yeah, the thing about Cook is that it kind of makes... I was in a very odd situation in terms of the famous Captain Cook controversy in anthropology because my partner for about 10 years was a student of Obisekara, and I'm a student of Solomon, so they couldn't know, right? Because they would have cared, you know? And it was a bitter thing. And Obisekara is basically saying, like, you know, you imperialist, how could you say that Hawaiians weren't so... It didn't have basic common sense to realize like what was really going on here. And Solomons is basically saying, you know, you imperialist, how can you be such a elitist to say these guys don't have their own, you know, everybody's cultural perspective is not equally legitimate. That Western rationality is the only one. I think that a synthesis. They're essentially asking different questions. Obisekara is asking more about Captain Cook than about the Hawaiians. You know, he's saying like, why was this guy so violent, even though he thought of himself as not being so. But I think yes, I think what most would say is like, and the reason why the story is compelling and why is because. Here's this guy, he shows up, and he's basically a space alien. This is the way we're used to reading the account. Nobody's ever seen anything like this. You're trying to figure out some parameter. If a flying saucer landed here now, people would be doing all sorts of weird things, It's not like there's some fault in rationality of Hawaiians because they didn't know what to make of something they'd never seen before and tried to apply all sorts of odd, mythic paradigms. We would do the same. But on the other hand, the question is, well, probably it wasn't flying saucer, probably they had every idea. I mean, if you think about it, the basic, most must have had something. He probably takes it too far. He has this famous quote about, that Natural History Museum, the famous quadrupedal boat that comes from the Flaherty movie, the guys with the masks and the canoe. When he came to New York, his first reaction was like, wow, when I saw that, I realized that must be just what ancient China was like. He really thought everything was flowing around interchangeably, but so he probably took it too far. But on the other hand, the version we have now, where like somehow the Polynesians go all the way to Easter Island, which is right next to South America, and stop. What's the chance of that? Yeah. So people probably were doing all sorts of things for a very long period of time.